Julia's crisis created a ripple effect. Would she let her crisis turn her in the wrong direction? Or would she let her actions define a positive future? Julia sat motionless on the hard plastic chair outside the manager's office, her fingers tightening around the crumpled piece of paper in her lap. The words on it blurred together. Termination notice. The ink felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of every unpaid bill waiting at home, the unopened eviction notice tucked in the kitchen drawer, and the wide, trusting eyes of her 8-year-old son Leo, who still believed his mother could fix anything. She had worked at the department store for nearly 5 years, showing up early, taking extra shifts, never once complaining even when the exhaustion settled deep into her bones. And yet none of it mattered when corporate decided to cut costs. "I'm really sorry, Julia," her manager had said, but the words had felt empty, like an echo in a vast, hollow room. She had nodded, too stunned to argue, too drained to demand an explanation that wouldn't change anything. Now as she sat there, the reality of her situation pressed in from all sides. No paycheck, no health insurance, no safety net. She walked out of the building in a daze, the early morning sun too bright, the sounds of the city too sharp, each footstep on the pavement reminding her of how unsteady everything had become. The bank account was already near empty, rent was due in a week, and she hadn't even figured out how to buy groceries for the next few days. She had always been resourceful, always found a way to make things work, but this time felt different. This time she didn't have a backup plan. Her feet carried her toward the small cafe on the corner, more out of habit than anything else. She used to come here on her lunch breaks when money wasn't such a terrifying thing, when a cup of coffee wasn't a luxury she had to calculate against bus fare or school supplies. She stepped inside, the scent of roasted beans and baked bread wrapping around her like an old memory. She shouldn't be here, every dollar mattered now, but the thought of sitting alone in her apartment staring at the walls was unbearable. She ordered a small black coffee, counting out the exact change from the bottom of her purse, then moved to the side, barely noticing the man standing next to her at the counter. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of something unseen. When the barista told him the total for his order, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over his wallet, his expression tightening just enough for Julia to recognize it. Hesitation not because he had forgotten something, but because he was debating whether he could afford it. Something in her chest tightened. She didn't know his story, didn't know what had left him looking like a man standing at the edge of something steep, but in that moment it didn't matter. Before she could second-guess herself, before she could remind herself that she was the one drowning, she stepped forward and handed the barista a $5 bill. "It's on me," she said, forcing a small smile. The man blinked, startled, as if kindness was something foreign to him. "You don't have to," he started, but she shook her head. "I know," she said simply. He accepted the coffee, staring down at the cup as if trying to understand why a stranger would do something for him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice quieter, almost unsure. Julia shrugged, brushing it off, but something about the moment lingered. It wasn't much. It wasn't going to change her circumstances or put food on the table, but for some reason, the simple act made her feel just a little less powerless. She turned to leave, not wanting to dwell on things she couldn't afford to think about, when she noticed an elderly woman sitting alone by the window, her hands wrapped tightly around an untouched cup of tea. The woman's face was drawn, her eyes distant, locked on something far beyond the streets outside. Julia hesitated, recognizing the unmistakable shadow of grief that clung to the woman's frame. She had seen that look before, on her own face in the mirror after her mother had passed, on the faces of strangers in hospital waiting rooms. Without thinking, she walked over, pulling a pack of tissues from her purse and placing it gently on the table. "It looks like you could use these," she said softly. The woman lifted her gaze, startled, then gave a small, watery laugh. "You have no idea," she whispered. For a moment they sat in silence, the space between them filled with something unspoken but understood. Julia didn't ask questions, didn't press for details, and yet as the woman took the tissues with a quiet "thank you," it felt like a small weight had been lifted. As Julia left the cafe, stepping back into the unforgiving reality of her own problems, she didn't know that the two strangers she had helped that morning, one with a cup of coffee, the other with a simple acknowledgement of pain, would soon become the people who changed the course of her life. She didn't know that her kindness, given without expectation, had set something into motion, like a stone skipping across the surface of a still lake, its ripples reaching farther than she could ever imagine. Daniel sat in his car outside the cafe long after Julia had disappeared into the city's relentless shuffle, the warmth of the coffee in his hands a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that had taken root inside him. He hadn't planned to come here today, not really. He had driven aimlessly for hours before ending up in this small corner of town, where the streets hummed with life but felt disconnected from the world he once knew. The cafe had been a last stop, a place to sit and think, a place to finalize the decision he had been wrestling with for weeks. It was supposed to be the day he walked away from everything, the day he stopped pretending he could fix what had already crumbled. A year ago he had been at the top, running a thriving tech company, making deals with executives who saw him as a rising star, living in a high-rise apartment that overlooked the city. Now all of it was gone. A bitter lawsuit, betrayals from business partners he once considered family, and a series of wrong decisions had drained his accounts and his will to fight. He had spent the last 6 months watching everything he had built slip through his fingers, drowning in the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He had come to the cafe that morning convinced that the last of his options had run out, that it was time to close down the company that bore his name, to let go of the last thing tethering him to a dream that had long since turned into a nightmare. But then something unexpected had happened. A stranger, a woman who had looked just as lost as he felt, had stepped forward and bought him a cup of coffee. A small thing. Insignificant, really. And yet it had stopped him in his tracks. He hadn't been able to process it at first, had stood there staring at the steaming cup as if it held some secret answer he had been searching for. It wasn't about the money. He could have paid for it himself even if his bank account was a shadow of what it once was. It was the gesture, the way she had offered it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It was the way she had looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what it was like to feel as though the ground beneath their feet had disappeared. It was a reminder that he wasn't invisible, that even in the midst of his failure, someone had seen him. And for the first time in months, something inside him stirred. He found himself gripping the cup tighter, as if anchoring himself to the moment, unwilling to let the feeling slip away. He thought about the choices that had led him here, the years of relentless ambition that had once defined him. He had spent so long chasing success, believing that the only measure of his worth was in numbers and deals and headlines. When had he stopped caring about the people behind it all? When had he become so consumed by the race that he had forgotten why he started running in the first place? He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, the weight on his chest shifting in a way that felt unfamiliar. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, wasn't sure if a single act of kindness could undo the damage of the past, but it was enough to make him hesitate, enough to keep him from making the final call that would shut his company down forever. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the unread messages from his assistant, the ones he had ignored in his haze of self-doubt. There was still unfinished business, people who depended on him, employees who had stood by him even when everything was falling apart. He had been ready to abandon them, ready to walk away and let the pieces fall where they may. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. For the first time in a long while he found himself considering a different path. What if he stopped chasing what he had lost and focused on building something new? Something meaningful? His company had started with a vision, one that had gotten lost in the endless pursuit of growth and expansion. What if he could return to that vision, reshape it into something better, something that mattered? He thought about the woman in the cafe, the quiet determination in her eyes despite whatever storm she was weathering. She had given freely even when she had nothing to spare. And here he was, with resources, with experience, with the ability to make a real impact, and he had been ready to throw it all away. The thought unsettled him, but it also sparked something he had long believed was gone: a sense of purpose. He wasn't sure where to start, wasn't sure if it was too late to turn things around, but for the first time in months he wasn't drowning in despair. He took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest, and reached for his car keys. There was work to be done. Evelyn sat by the cafe window, her fingers curled around the delicate porcelain of her untouched tea, staring past the streaked glass at a world that no longer felt like her own. It had been 6 months since her husband James had passed, and yet every morning she still woke up expecting to find him beside her, breathing softly in the early dawn, his hand reaching instinctively for hers as he always had. The silence of her house had become unbearable, each room echoing with the absence of his presence, the walls holding memories that no longer felt like a comfort but a relentless reminder of what she had lost. She had never known grief could be so heavy, that it could seep into her bones and make every step feel like wading through thick, unforgiving fog. People told her time would ease the pain, that it would become more bearable, that one day she would wake up and not feel the crushing weight of emptiness pressing against her chest. But those words felt like lies spoken by people who had never truly loved and lost. James had been her home, her anchor in a world that had always felt too fast, too chaotic, too unpredictable. Without him she was unmoored, adrift in days that stretched endlessly, each one identical to the last. She hadn't meant to come here today. She had stopped visiting their favorite places after he was gone, unable to bear the way the memories clung to every corner, whispering his name in the simplest of things. The chair he always sat in, the way he would order her tea before she could say a word, the sound of his laughter mingling with the hum of the cafe. But something had pulled her here this morning, something she couldn't name, a need to be somewhere other than the suffocating quiet of her house. And so she had come, ordering the same tea she always did, only to find that the act of sitting alone, of staring at his empty chair, was almost too much to bear. Her throat ached with the effort of holding back tears, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the napkin beside her, only to find she had forgotten to bring tissues, again. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of her grief, but it felt like the final crack in an already crumbling dam. She closed her eyes, inhaling sharply, willing herself to keep it together, because breaking down in the middle of a crowded cafe was something she refused to allow herself to do. And then, unexpectedly, a hand gently placed something on the table beside her. A small pack of tissues, unassuming and ordinary, but in that moment, it felt like the most profound gesture of kindness she had received in months. Evelyn looked up, startled, and found herself staring into the eyes of a young woman she had never met, her face kind but weary, as if she too carried burdens that no one else could see. "It looks like you could use these," the woman said softly, her voice gentle, without pity or intrusion, just quiet understanding. Evelyn blinked, a tear slipping past her defenses before she could stop it, and to her own surprise she let out a small, choked laugh. "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The woman gave a small, knowing smile, not pressing for details, not offering empty reassurances, just standing there in shared silence before nodding and walking away. Evelyn watched her go, something in her chest loosening just slightly, as if the unbearable weight she had been carrying had shifted, even if only by the smallest fraction. She sat there for a long time, staring at the tissues in her hand, something about the moment lingering in a way she couldn't quite explain. It had been so long since she had felt seen, since someone had acknowledged her pain without trying to fix it, without offering well-meaning but empty words about how she should move on, find new hobbies, meet new people. This stranger had given her something far more valuable than a handful of tissues. She had given her the simple but profound reminder that she was not invisible, that her grief did not make her untouchable. And for the first time in months, Evelyn felt something other than numbness. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The faintest whisper of connection, a reminder that even in loss, life had a way of reaching out in the most unexpected ways. She took a slow, shaky breath, wiping her eyes before finally lifting the tea to her lips, the warmth of it soothing in a way it hadn't been in months. She didn't know it yet, but that brief moment of kindness would set something in motion inside her, a shift so subtle she almost didn't recognize it. It would take time. Grief was not something that disappeared overnight. But for the first time she found herself considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still something waiting for her beyond the grief. Maybe she could find purpose again, find a way to step forward without leaving James behind, but instead carrying him with her in the ways that mattered. She didn't know the young woman's name, didn't know what had prompted her to reach out, but she knew that small act had changed something in her, something she hadn't even realized needed changing. She sat there a little longer, watching the world move past the window, and for the first time in a long time she did not feel entirely alone. The morning air was crisp when Daniel stepped out of his apartment, his mind unusually clear for the first time in months. He had spent the night sifting through old files, reviewing business plans that had long been abandoned, searching for something, anything, that could help him see his company through the storm. He had been so close to giving up, so dangerously close to letting failure consume him, but something about that morning at the cafe had shaken him. It was absurd, really, how a simple cup of coffee had become the catalyst for something much larger. But it wasn't just the coffee. It was the unspoken understanding in the woman's eyes, the quiet way she had extended kindness despite carrying struggles of her own. It had reminded him of the very reason he had started his company in the first place. It had never been about money or power, though he had fooled himself into thinking it was. It had been about building something meaningful, something that gave people a chance to create better lives. Somewhere along the way, that vision had gotten lost in the pursuit of expansion, but now, staring at the scattered papers on his desk, he realized he had an opportunity to reclaim it. His company wasn't beyond saving, not yet. But if he was going to rebuild, it had to be different. It had to matter. That morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He visited the community job center, a small, often overlooked facility in the city where struggling individuals came looking for second chances. He had funded it once in his early years, before he became too busy to care about anything beyond the next big deal. As he stepped inside, the sight of worn-out chairs, outdated computers, and exhausted job seekers filled him with a sense of urgency. He spoke with the center's director, an old friend who had once admired his ambition, and as they talked, an idea took shape. His company had been built on talent, on hiring the best, the brightest, the most qualified. But what if, instead, he focused on those who had been overlooked? The single parents desperate for steady income, the veterans struggling to reintegrate, the middle-aged workers cast aside by younger competition. What if he rebuilt his company with them in mind? The more he thought about it, the more the idea took hold. He wouldn't just save his business, he would reshape it into something that actually served the people who needed it most. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn stood in front of the volunteer center, her heart pounding in a way that made her feel both foolish and alive. It had been years since she had stepped foot in a place like this, and she had nearly convinced herself to turn back. But something about that encounter at the cafe, about the girl who had seen her grief without shrinking away from it, had planted a seed of courage she hadn't expected. She had spent 6 months locked away in her sorrow, believing that she had nothing left to offer the world, that without James she had lost the best parts of herself. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe there was still something she could give. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the doors, greeted by the warm chatter of volunteers bustling through their morning routines. She had always admired people who dedicated their lives to helping others, but she had never thought of herself as one of them. Not until now. The director welcomed her in, surprised but eager, and within minutes, Evelyn found herself in the break room, sitting across from a young mother who looked as though the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The woman, barely more than a girl, stared down at the table, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice small. "I lost my job. I have a baby. I don't even know where to start." And just like that, Evelyn saw herself reflected in this stranger. Not in age, not in circumstance, but in the raw, aching uncertainty of loss. She reached out, resting a gentle hand over the young woman's. "You start here," she said softly. And as she said the words, she realized she was speaking to herself as much as she was speaking to the girl in front of her. Neither Daniel nor Evelyn knew that their decisions that day would set into motion a chain of events that would circle back to the very woman who had unknowingly touched both of their lives. They didn't know that Julia, the woman who had given Daniel a coffee and Evelyn a moment of grace, was about to face a crisis far worse than she had imagined. They didn't know that the very ripples they had sent into the world were about to find their way back to her, in ways none of them could have predicted. Julia sat at the small kitchen table, the final notice from her landlord spread out in front of her, the bold red letters demanding action she had no means to take. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, as if touching it gently might somehow soften its reality. The past few weeks had been a brutal exercise in endurance, stretching every dollar until it became air, skipping meals so Leo wouldn't have to, applying for job after job with no response, her hope thinning like frayed fabric. She had known desperation before, but never like this. Never the kind that gnawed at her, that made her feel like she was slowly disappearing into a void where she was nothing more than an overdue bill, a financial burden, a single mother with no options left. The weight of it was suffocating. She had tried so hard to stay afloat, to hold it together, but sitting here now, in the dim light of her kitchen with eviction looming, she could feel herself unraveling. Leo was asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of how close they were to losing everything. She had promised him she would figure it out, had assured him they would be okay. But the truth was she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Her phone vibrated, a sharp break in the heavy silence, and she almost didn't look at it. Another rejection email, another overdue balance alert. She didn't think she could take any more bad news. But when she glanced at the screen, she didn't recognize the number. Some part of her, the part still clinging to hope despite everything, made her pick up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice rough with exhaustion. A warm voice responded on the other end, introducing herself as Evelyn, a volunteer from a local organization that helped single mothers find work. The name sparked something faint in Julia's memory, but she couldn't quite place it. Evelyn explained that she had come across Julia's information through a referral. Someone had heard about her situation and recommended her for a job opening. "It's with a company that focuses on helping people get back on their feet," Evelyn said. "The owner believes in second chances. They're looking for someone responsible, hardworking, someone like you." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "A job? A real job?" The words felt too good to be true, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Who referred me?" she asked, her mind racing through the list of people who might have remembered her struggles. There was a pause on the other end before Evelyn responded. "Someone who said you once showed them kindness when they needed it most." The words sent a chill through Julia, a flicker of recognition snapping into place. The coffee. The tissue. She thought back to that morning, to the exhausted man she had paid for and the grieving woman she had reached out to. Could it really be them? Could such small gestures have somehow led to this? Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone tighter. I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears burning behind her eyes. Evelyn's voice was gentle. "Say yes. Come in for an interview. Give yourself the chance you deserve." Julia sat in stunned silence after the call ended, the weight of everything shifting, not disappearing but suddenly feeling a little lighter. She pressed her hands to her face, letting the tears come this time, but they were different. Not tears of despair, but of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Gratitude. Hope. She thought about how that morning in the cafe had been one of her worst, how she had felt so lost, so powerless. And yet, in that moment she had chosen to give. Not because she had much to spare, but because she understood what it meant to need something, anything, to remind her that she wasn't alone. And somehow, impossibly, that small act had found its way back to her, circling through the lives of strangers until it returned as an open door just when she needed it most. The next morning she stood outside the office building, nerves twisting in her stomach. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to be real. When she stepped inside, she was greeted by a receptionist who directed her to the hiring manager's office. She took a deep breath, smoothing her wrinkled blouse, rehearsing the words she wanted to say. And then the door opened and she froze. Sitting behind the desk was the man from the cafe, Daniel. He looked different now, more put together, his exhaustion replaced by something steadier, more determined. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, two people whose lives had unknowingly intertwined. And then he smiled, standing to shake her hand. "Julia," he said, as if tasting the weight of her name. "We've been expecting you." Julia sat across from Daniel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in years. She had spent the past several weeks bracing for doors to slam in her face, for one more rejection, for another polite but firm, "We'll keep your application on file." But now, here she was, seated in an office that was more modest than she expected, sunlight pouring in through the wide windows, the city stretching behind them like a living mural. The man in front of her was the same one she had bought coffee for weeks ago, though he looked different now, more grounded, more sure of himself. It was surreal, this moment, as if life had suddenly stitched itself together in a way she never could have predicted. She was still processing how Evelyn, the woman she had offered tissues to in passing, had been the one to recommend her for this job, how Daniel, the burnt-out man she had paid for in line, had become the person sitting across from her, deciding whether she deserved a chance. But even through her disbelief, a part of her recognized that this was something bigger than coincidence. She had spent so long feeling invisible, drowning under the weight of struggles that no one seemed to notice, but now it was as if the universe had turned around and whispered, "I saw you." Daniel leaned forward, his hands steepled as he regarded her with something like quiet admiration. He wasn't just going through the motions of an interview, He was studying her, recognizing her in the same way she recognized him. "Julia," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like he had been waiting to say it. "You don't know how much I've been looking forward to this conversation." She swallowed, unsure of how to respond. How could she explain the past few weeks, the way every hardship had seemed to lead her to this very moment? She had walked in expecting to list her qualifications, to prove her worth in rehearsed sentences about work ethic and experience. But this felt different. It felt personal. I really appreciate the opportunity," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know I don't have the most impressive resume, but Daniel lifted a hand, cutting her off with a shake of his head. "That's not why you're here," he said, his smile soft but firm. "You're here because someone once did something for me when they didn't have to. And that changed everything." His words hung between them, weighty with meaning. He told her then about that morning in the cafe, how he had been at his breaking point, how her simple act had made him reconsider everything. He told her about how that moment had pushed him to step back into his company, not to salvage what was left of his former success, but to rebuild it into something that actually mattered. "I don't want this business to be like before," he admitted. "I don't want to chase profits at the expense of people. I want to create opportunities for people who need them. And when Evelyn told me about you, I knew this was exactly the kind of full-circle moment I had been hoping for." Julia blinked rapidly, her throat tightening with emotion. It was too much to process all at once, the way her smallest actions had rippled outward, coming back to her in the form of a lifeline she hadn't even known she needed. She had been drowning, convinced she was alone, but now, here she was, not just being offered a job but being seen in a way she never had been before. For the first time in weeks, relief washed over her, warm and steady. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to reclaim a life that had been slipping through her fingers. It was stability for Leo. It was proof that the kindness she had given had not been in vain. And as Daniel extended his hand across the desk, offering her not just employment but something far greater, a place to belong, she reached for it without hesitation. When their hands met, it wasn't just a business transaction. It was the culmination of something far deeper. A quiet but undeniable affirmation that goodness, no matter how small, had a way of returning when it was needed most.